Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's podcast. I'm really delighted to have somebody recommended by Margaret Casey-Hamford, who's been on the podcast before. He's a very inspiring man. He has done so much already in his life. Not only has he played as an athlete with the NFL, he's also played rugby, had a terrible accident, which was unfortunate, changed the course of his life. But he's now also a broadcaster, just come back from the Eagles versus the Kansas City Chiefs at the Super Bowl. And just a fascinating man who I've learned a lot from already in a short space of time. Without further ado, would you introduce yourself?
Thank you for that glowing introduction. I'm Christian Scotland-Williamson, former two-sport professional athlete, current broadcaster, speaker, and future barrister. It's been an excellent journey, but one that isn't ending anytime soon.
Life's never going to be dull for you, Christian, is it? You just don't do things by half. So, Christian, we were talking before we started about inspiring leadership, and perhaps a person that you found to be an inspiring leader and the qualities that they showed. So, who would you call out?
Outside of my family, so the two that are first and foremost are, of course, my mother and father. But beyond that, I would actually say Alistair Kirkwood, former managing director of the NFL in the UK, and the reason why now people have a dedicated Sky Sports channel to NFL and also 3 London games per year. So he is someone who's been instrumental in my journey to the NFL, but also since leaving in managing my career as a broadcaster and beyond.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I'm looking forward at some stage you're going to connect us, and we'll perhaps see if we can get Alistair onto the program as well, because he's got a great story about promoting NFL in the UK, making it what it is, as you say. So you mentioned your mother and father. Parents are important to people. Some people have parents that they wish they hadn't chosen. We don't choose our parents. Others, like you, are very fortunate and very grateful to their parents, as I am to mine. Tell me about your life journey that shaped you as a leader that you are today already in a short space of time, and who the people were that were influential to you in your life, such as your mother and father. Tell us a bit about that.
I think you have to go back to the very beginning and discuss my grandparents first and foremost. They were part of that Windrush generation that chose to leave the Caribbean and come to England in search of a better opportunity and education for their children, and more dreams that could become attainable. And I think I'm a product of that, where those messages, those sayings, all of the old school Caribbean discipline was passed down through my parents. And now I'm able to fly at a much higher altitude and succeed in arenas, and multiple arenas, that could only have been dreams for my grandparents. So I think it starts there. But beyond that, it's understanding that both of my parents were the first in their family to be born in England. I saw both of my parents get their degrees because I was a child at the time. And I was able to see that hard work and discipline that my father had, from a boxing career to the police force and then becoming a criminal barrister. But beyond that, the passion and support that my mother gave him, which has now been transferred to me and supported me in all of my dreams, which, behind every man, or even next to every man, is a great woman, and none more so than my mother.
Well, that's a great story. And I think, as you say, the old school Caribbean standards, I think of my best friend and best man, Errol Stewart, who's in Jamaica. Errol is the same age as me. Perhaps he's maybe a year old. He's 62. But his mother was from Cuba. His father was from Jamaica. And old school Caribbean standards, which got him into the Jamaican Armed Forces. And then we met as officer cadets at the Royal Military Academy Santos. He's going to come and stay with me this year, but he was my best man when I got married in Ocho Rios in Jamaica. And he also got me to give a speech to the Jamaican Defence Force. And I met General Rocky Meade. What a great name, Rocky, who's a small, wiry, but very bright and very capable leader who went to become their chief of their general staff. And now he's in an ambassadorial role. And I'm hoping to get him on the podcast because he's a truly inspired leader. But lovely, this, your father, the ABA boxing champion, a policeman and barrister. And I was wondering, the barrister connection, it is an interesting one. And also I was reflecting on our patterns of behavior today are shaped by our parents and our grandparents and their parents too. And sometimes it's quite good. I did the Hoffman process recently, and to try and break the patterns of the more negative behaviors that we inherit, which we don't even think about, but we try and mirror and copy. I mean, in this case, you're going to go and go to the bar and you want to become a lawyer. There you can see on the pictures behind me, a picture of my father on his airplane. He was a fast jet pilot and an officer, and me next to him as an officer. You know, you tend to be drawn into either doing the opposite or some similar things to your parents, because that's what you know. You can choose many things in life, but you can't choose to who you're born and where you're born. Those things are beyond your control. Any thoughts that you have on that the influence of parents and, you know, what went on for their generations, and also that lovely Caribbean connection, but then the UK as well?
Definitely. I think that I've been blessed where I've been able to benefit from the best of both of my parents and tried to limit the things that you'd want to improve on. I have the caring, kind-hearted, soft, delicate nature of my mother that perhaps wasn't afforded to men of that generation in the same way, to be expressive in their emotions, which ultimately has allowed me to be more vulnerable in certain situations where I've needed to rebuild myself and seek help, for example. But beyond that, I would say that my mother really taught me, but my dad showed me, where for long periods growing up, I actually didn't see him that much because he was always working. And then as you get older, you start to put things together and realize that the sacrifices that were made, where absence was actually the biggest blessing, where it actually was in your interest not to have him around all of the time because he was either studying, trying to get his degree to then become a barrister, as well as working shift work for the police. But supported by that was my mum, who was always there whenever I needed her and picked up the phone, even to this day where I'm a grown man, but I always know that I have that support. So in terms of continuing patterns or breaking patterns, I would say that emotional unavailability that men have had of that generation, I think that I've been able to break that somewhat. But beyond that, it's having the courage to step away from situations that were no longer serving me or no longer allowing me to fulfill my potential, and deciding to leave rugby and go and pursue the unknown in American football, but also underpinning all of that with education, because I saw my father decide not to pursue a professional boxing career because his contemporaries now are either destitute, alcoholics, gambling addicts, and the balance of probabilities was definitely not favoring a positive outcome. So I guess in terms of recognizing patterns, as an 8-year-old or 9-year-old writing into my yearbook when I left primary school that I wanted to be a barrister, I never had ambitions of being a professional athlete, let alone a two-sport professional athlete. And I would say that growing up with both of my parents and the messages and the things that they've instilled in me has given me the confidence to navigate all the different arenas that I've entered in my journey thus far, but being able to understand them at a much earlier stage of my life rather than truly figuring everything out for the first time for myself.
Well, what a journey you've had already. I mean, I think you're just almost 30 now. With a short while to go, you'll be 30, and happy birthday when you eventually get there. But it was 21 when you broke your back. Was that right? Because you played not only NFL, which is a hell of a thing, and there's some great pictures of you looking like an absolute bruiser. And who would know that you're now going to be training as a lawyer, and then the rugby. So tell us a bit about that story.
It's an unexpected journey again, because I grew too large for football and I was put in goal. And I played for a good team, so the ball was never in my half. So I found it was a bit of a waste of my time and athletic potential. So then one of my family friends said, "Why don't you try rugby?" My dad was a boxer. My brother ended up playing basketball. So all of us had our own respective disciplines. And I went down to the local rugby club and I never looked back. I loved it. And then I went to the Royal Grammar School, High Wycombe, which is a very good rugby school, which has produced a few England internationals. But I was never in an academy. I never played county rugby or representative rugby for any England age groups or anything like that. And I felt like I was always overlooked. But in hindsight, it allowed me to have a very normal childhood and normal existence, where the only reason why I played sport was for fun and to have fun with my friends. It was never really pressured in terms of being 13, 14 years old in an academy having to turn up for camps and trainings in your school holidays, and knowing that if you don't do it then you'll never be a professional. So I was able to have a normal education, normal childhood, and that's why I've been able to pursue high level academia while playing, because I only got my chance in my final year of study at Loughborough University, where Worcester Warriors, who have had their recent troubles, but at the time were in the Premiership and needed a player to stand in for a reserve fixture. I went down and played, and within 6 weeks, I was signing my first professional contract in the changing room before my first 15 debut, and then I scored on my debut and never looked back. So it's been an abrupt and very quick journey, but it was one that I was always prepared for, because I've obviously got a high sporting pedigree in terms of my family. But beyond that, I had the discipline and ability to recognize an opportunity when I did have it.
It is very interesting, this this high performing ethos that ran through your parents, ran through you, your brother, and I'm the same, very sort of driven by high performing, trying to be world class at whatever I do. But it also can be quite intense, can't it? And it puts such huge pressure on ourselves, let alone anybody else. We've just got this really high bar. You know, I have a long dead man who was a hero commanding officer, saving the lives of 2 other people, but dying in the process himself. They lived, he died so that they could live. That's a hell of a bar to try and live up to. How can you ever live up to that? And in your own way, you've got there the policeman, the barrister, the boxer, and a lovely mother. And it's hard. And have you ever found it like you're thinking, you know, I'm coming short, or I've got to achieve more? Have you ever found you've just got too intense?
I think so. I think when I was younger, my brother was involved in the Great Britain under-20 basketball team. My dad had boxed for GB and won the ABAs. And objectively, I'd done nothing really. I just played schoolboy rugby, played in the Daily Mail Cup semi-final, and that was it until I got my chance at university. So that always, it weighed on me, but not significantly to the point of my detriment. It was more in the back of my mind that I'm cut from the same cloth. I have the same genes and athletic potential, but nothing really came of it until I took my chance and turned professional. But I would say that there have been different stages of my career where defining success and failure have been problematic, where it's not a zero-sum game, but objectively, when you're in the performance industry, you measure yourself on wins and losses, and being able to not attach your identity, your value, and who you are as a person to outcomes, and instead into process. That's something that I've continually had to work on, because objectively, there have been moments where you have to overcome adversity, you have to deal with unfair situations and things that you would have differently, but you can't control that. And those outcomes are difficult to swallow at times, especially in the short term, but with time and understanding, as well as having other goals and other things to turn to. I think that's why I've always studied while I've been playing, because when my on-field performance has been limited through injury or time recovering, I've been able to extract some value and feel like I'm still moving forward with other areas of my life.
Yeah, it is a really good point. You can't put your whole identity and everything behind the winning and that sporting prowess. I know too many people who've been in sports and, like you, they got injured and they have to choose a different course. My brother Graham played for the England schoolboys under 19s against the Australians, North of England schoolboys, and he was chosen in the days when it was quite amateur. He was a number 8, and you know, not everybody was built like you, and in those days you could get away with it, but there wasn't so much intensity. But of course, when he was then training as a doctor in London, he found he was injured more often than his patients. Because it was starting to get quite violent and quite vicious, and if you weren't built like a house, you could take some injuries. Though even The Rock has had so many injuries. If you list all his injuries out, every bit of his body is broken. He takes his injuries too. Just doesn't stop you having it. So I think it's very sensible of you to plan for something else. And when it does happen that you can't carry on with a sporting career, you've got to make use of it. But there's a lovely connection between leadership and many of the skills about team building and working together and sharing and others, and in business. But of course, you're now going into a legal profession, which is often like you're my role model, Harry Matuvu, King's Counsel, who is an awesome individual and championing so many worthy causes. But I found Harry, when we were talking about leadership, he goes, in many ways, you just must remember that I'm actually a bit of a solo act. I'm actually operating on my own. I'm almost like they work for themselves. And so in some ways, it's a solo player rather than being a team player in the legal profession. What's your thoughts?
I think that growing up playing team sports, my dad was a boxer, which is an individual sport. So he always encouraged my brother and I to play team sports because he knows it's a lonely process. It's a lonely endeavor where he always used to have this anecdote of, I used to go running on Christmas morning because I knew no one else would be running then. And so I've grown up with an individual practitioner in every sense of the word, as a boxer, now as a barrister, as the head of my household. And then now I've completed my journey in team sports, and I'm actually entering an individual pursuit as a barrister rather than being a solicitor and working for a firm. And I think within that, it's a lot of responsibility, and you have to have courage to be able to manage your time and understand what your vision of what your life and work should look like. But beyond that, I don't think that removes any sense of leadership or responsibility from you, because the inspiration I've had from even listening to Harry's journey and what he's done as a barrister, where I'm now pursuing a career at the commercial bar, and on the junior end, there are few and far between that look like me.
Yeah.
And the visibility piece and what that can mean in terms of lasting legacy it's beyond, I think, understanding until you experience it for yourself. Where I played rugby, where I only ever had up to 3 teammates who were people of color, even in the professional ranks, maybe 5. And then I've been thrown into an environment in the Pittsburgh Steelers where I have a black head coach, and Coach Mike Tomlin, a Hall of Fame coach who's never had a losing season. My position coach was also a black man who'd been coaching in the NFL for over 20 years, been to 4 Super Bowls. And then I'm surrounded by a 70% black locker room and black success for the first time in my life, where until that date, as a 24-year-old, the only people in my life who I'd seen in responsible and leadership roles in a sporting context were either my uncles when I was playing under 5s football, or my dad. And understanding what that meant for me as a person, as a man, and coming back with that experience now and looking at the bar and looking at people like Harry Matovu, KC, and what he's done, being able to then hopefully serve as the next generation's beacon of potential and what could be, is something that's not wasted on me. And especially having navigated both the sporting context and now looking to enter that arena, it's combating the old tropes, which I experienced firsthand when I was playing, where people stood in the way of me pursuing further education and doing my master's, because I was only really valued for my physical output rather than my mental.
It is interesting that you talk about being in the locker room there with the Pittsburgh Steelers, where having been a person of color and being, the odd man out, you were suddenly among a whole load of role models. It must be great, and they must stay with you now, those people who are all around you. And were they very supportive of you?
Incredibly. And also it was a cultural exchange as well, because even though they're both English-speaking countries, culturally, and especially the unique culture of rugby and the unique culture of American football, they're complete opposites. And so as part of that cultural exchange, I was forced to interact with people who had never met an English black person before, and were saying things like, I've never met an African-American English person before. And I had to stop them and say, I'm not African-American, I'm a black English person, and I sound like this is my real voice. And for a lot of people who are from rural Alabama, they'd never left the country. And so coming into contact with me, in some respects, was almost like coming into contact with an alien, where they had so many genuine questions, and trying to really understand what life was like for another culture. So it was a cross exchange of information, where I was able to get an appreciation for what life would be like for them growing up in black communities in rural Alabama versus what I had experienced in my life to date. So it was something that definitely I think will be a defining period of my life in terms of understanding who I am as a person.
And what was it like for them in rural Alabama? I mean, I've just been listening to the Grant Takes Command, recommended by General David Petraeus, who was on the podcast a couple of episodes ago, and all about, Black American soldiers fighting for the federal side, and they weren't given much chance until the last minute, and they stormed the heights of, I'll think of it, was near Richmond, Petersburg, and very successful in that bit, but often weren't given the confidence or the opportunity. But of course, they were fighting against the South, who were all for slavery and keeping it the way things were. What for these modern day guys from Alabama, what was it like for them growing up?
I think especially within the bubble and the insulation that being a football player offers you and the protection, it also is a lot of anxiety where effectively a community's hopes and dreams rest on your shoulders to be the one that makes out, to be the one that changes a generation and all the generations to come of that area and community and family, where more often than not, the player will get drafted to a team and their whole family will move out with them. That's cousins, that's mothers and fathers. And for a lot of them, fathers weren't on the scene. So they are figuring things out for the first time, where it made me realize the blessing where I had a two-parent household, which a lot of people aren't privileged to have, and the security that comes with that, as well as having a father who was absent, but absent in a productive way rather than absent through lack of care potentially or lack of involvement. And I think that's the biggest thing that I realized and I came away extremely grateful for, was that there were lessons that I was able to learn in terms of being a man and leadership and morals and values and core responsibilities and duties that you should have, that I didn't have to figure out for the first time on my own. And a lot of these young men are in that situation where for their community, the only hope is to rap or go to the league. And so education and output in terms of their mental capacity isn't valued as much as being in an arena with 80,000 people screaming your name.
Yeah. No, it's a whole culturally different experience. And then taking it from there to looking and reflecting back on the whole of your life thus far, what would be one of your proudest, happiest moments, and what did you learn from that? And what would be one of your personally darkest moments, and what did you learn from that?
So I will begin with what I thought was the darkest moment at the time, and then that was superseded by something else later down the line, was breaking my back. I broke my back. I had a car accident and went into my first pre-season with a bad hip, and it all came to a head where I ended up with 2 fractures in my back and needed surgery, which kept me out of sport for 726 days. And it's that date's burnt into my memory, which is just shy of 2 years. In that time, I had to ask myself the real fundamental questions about life, about where I was going, about who I was, because I'd never been in an academy. Suddenly, I had won the starting job of my new franchise, my new career. And then within 2 weeks, I was out of action, couldn't walk properly, and had to relearn how to walk, then how to jog, then how to run. And that process took 2 years. And in that time, I decided to go back and develop my mind, and went back to university, went to University of Birmingham and studied for my master's in international business, because I didn't know if I was going to have to retire. I didn't know what was around the corner, but I knew that I didn't want to come out of this experience just the same, where each scan I was having every 6 months, it was inconclusive. I wasn't sure if it was healing properly or not. And so there might have been a time where it was medically decided that I wouldn't play again. But if I didn't do something in that time to develop myself as a person, namely study, then I wouldn't have been able to be happy with just sitting and waiting for a result to come my way. So the happiest moment out of that darkness was actually walking the stage for my graduation. And then 3 weeks later, I was on my way to the NFL, having left rugby. So I managed to turn the pain of a broken back and find the purpose in it, and in understanding the discipline, the habits, and the commitment required to learn how to walk, and then ultimately play in the Premiership again, to then using that to get my master's, to then going to the NFL and understanding that I'd overcome what was a horrendous time in my life. And then similarly, when I left the NFL, I left with a a badly diagnosed injury, which then ended up requiring 4 surgeries. Again, I had to learn how to walk again. I had to learn how to run again, and ended up coming back and playing in the Premiership with Harlequins. But then deciding that I wanted more in terms of opportunity, in terms of my life. And I completed my law conversion and my master's in law while I was playing for Harlequins. And now that's put me up in the position where, as a 29-year-old, I'm 5 weeks of teaching away and some exams, and then I can call myself a barrister in England and Wales.
Fantastic. Well, what a story. My God. And I'm thinking particularly, you get injured once, twice, and then you go into NFL with those old injuries, and then you get injured again. You're going to have to look after yourself so that in later life, it isn't all going to start seizing up on you, all that inflammation and the injuries. But I'm sure you'll keep that ticking over. Wow. Well, look, congratulations on all that you've done thus far, particularly those moments in hospital, as I know myself, when in deep pain in hospital, and you're lying there thinking, this is not easy. How do I manage the pain? How do I think through it? How do I look for a future? What can I do from here? What is my life like? Bit of advice you wish you had when you started out. Here you are, 29. When you're back at 16 years old, knowing what you know now, Christian, in those intervening years, what advice would you give to yourself? Don't worry about this, and this bit is important. What would you say isn't important, or what is important to someone at that age?
I definitely say, don't worry about who's winning right now. It's a long race, and it's about consistency over short-term victories. Because objectively, there was a time when I used to go to the England under-18s and under-20s games and watch on the sideline and think I could be playing in this, but I never had the opportunity to showcase my talents. And of the people who were playing in those games I used to watch, not many have had the career that I've had. And they were all in the academy setups, in the county setups, regional setups that I wasn't. And if I had allowed that to get to my heart and discourage me at the time, instead of fueling me to understand that I have what it takes and it's just about an opportunity that didn't come my way when I was younger, then if I'd looked around me at that time, I would have been more stressed. Whereas now, if I could go back and tell myself, don't worry, everything will happen in your time, then that's the advice I give myself.
Well, and the other thing is, for those listening on Apple, Spotify, and other platforms, you've got one hell of a collection of trophies around you. And there is a particular one which I like with all the tassels hanging off it. What's that one? What's that one behind you?
So that's actually a funny one. That's a fantasy football show that I won recently, which was good. I haven't actually had that much of a decorated career. Through injury and other things, I felt like I was always a semi-finalist, which was extremely hard to take. We spoke about this earlier, where the win and loss column, it's hard not to let yourself be consumed by that. And I've lost a lot of semi-finals and never had my moment, as in America they say, where the confetti rains down and you're a champion. And that was something that I think driven me, where I don't take an opportunity for granted, and I will always give my best effort, because it's for me. I know that the fruits of my labor may be enjoyed by someone else, but in terms of a foundation stone and a core principle, it's if I give my best effort, I know I can walk away with my head held high regardless of the outcome. And so the reason why I have that trophy there is because it's the first trophy I've won in 10 years.
Well, also, and there's a very clever system behind it. It's almost like a moving picture screen.
Yeah.
Which changes over every so often. Those are cool. What is that? Is that just
so I have my a few inspiring photos. So this one at the moment is Muhammad Ali with Malcolm X behind, but that rotates between photos of me on my journey in America, my dad boxing, and things that sometimes I pinch myself that I've done. That's why I have my jersey hanging in the hallway next to my best friend Jordan Mailata, because both of us within 5 years, we started playing American football the same day. And I've just got back from broadcasting with BBC 5 Live, the Super Bowl. And my best friend, whose jersey's hanging just next to that, was playing and starting as a left tackle for the Philadelphia Eagles. And neither of us had put on a helmet, buckled a chin strap, or knew the slightest thing about American football 5 years ago. And for us both to be operating at the biggest stage, me broadcasting and him playing, every time I walk past those jerseys and have the inspiration from the photos, it just reminds me that every day ordinary people do extraordinary things, and I've been blessed to be along for the ride for some real history that's been made in America.
Yeah, and I can see why you're such a successful public speaker, and you very kindly do it as speakers for schools. You got some great stories, and I think sometimes people who go straight to success without any setbacks on the way, they haven't got as many stories as those of us who've had injuries and failure and setbacks and disappointments and things that we wanted to go for we never got, and think at the time it was the worst thing that could possibly happen, that we didn't get it, or that you broke your back or whatever it might be. And then years later, you realize that actually, as Michael Caine said, seize the difficulty in any situation. What's the difficulty? What are you going to make of it? And his story was when he was acting and doing method acting, and someone was having a fight in the house, and he had to open the door and step in. And the couple fighting had thrown a chair, and it had lodged in the doorway, and he couldn't get the door open. So he was saying to the director, "Can't get the door open." And he goes, "Seize the difficulty. If it's a comedy, fall over the chair. If it's a drama, smash the chair. Seize the difficulty." So I think you've definitely done that already, and you've learned early. If there was one thing you could change in life, if you could live it again, what would it be? And if there was a crucible moment that has shaped you, what are those crucible moments? Perhaps tell us one of each.
I think they both almost fit into the same answer, really, which is I would go back and have the courage to stand up for myself more earlier in my career, where I was facing injustice, I was facing things that weren't going my way, and I knew that they weren't internally and in my gut. And I think that's why I needed to go through those to then become such a fierce advocate for opportunity and fairness, because I've experienced firsthand the negative aspects of that, and multiple times. I think potentially that's what's fueled me to want to be a fierce advocate in the future, pursuing the bar, because there's been difficulties where an information asymmetry, where you're a young player trying to make his way, trying to chase a dream, and things don't go according to plan, and then certain people are behaving in a certain way, but you don't have the courage to stand up for yourself because you don't want to lose the opportunity, because it is a rare opportunity. Whereas now it's easy to say with hindsight, and having accomplished what I have in my career and had the experiences that I've had, that I could go back and do it differently. But I was making the best decisions I could at the time, but with the information that I have now, I would have stood up for myself with more conviction earlier.
Yeah. No, it's good to know that, which leads us on nicely to the Inspiring Leadership Compass, the 8 components that we found, my wife Lee and I, as we researched what makes high performers like you and others inspiring leaders into very successful people in their lives. And as you say, sometimes people appear very successful early in their career, but it's a long race. Mm-hmm. And I look back and saw myself quite a failure in many times in my life. But actually, I've had some high points. I've been a world champion double mountain marathon, and I've done other things where working for the head of the army or doing airborne training and getting my parachute wings and my maroon beret. I was very proud of those moments. But I've also had some real down points. But actually, in the race, I feel like now at the moment I'm in a really great place, and I'm counting the blessings of every day. I'm alive. My brother David isn't. He died of cancer last year, and we didn't see that coming. You don't know when anything's coming, so make the most of it is certainly a message for me. Going around the Inspiring Leadership Compass, moral quotient, MQ, true north. Yeah. We can all have our own values set, but what have you done when you've let it slip? The values that you hold as important, Christian. And I don't know whether you've done this, but I've certainly found myself drifting and not sticking to those values. And you need to get yourself back on track. What's your advice about helping people get themselves back on track to really good, solid values of the way of behaving and principles by which to live your life?
I think you have to ask yourself the fundamental questions and figure out what you really want, because anyone can read something that someone else has put together, but it might not resonate in the same way. And so that might be the reason for any drift. As we've already spoken about at length, early in my career, I broke my back and I really had to go back to the drawing board with my back against the wall and ask myself those fundamental questions, and even wrote down almost what is my cornerstone of my life. And on that would be faith, family, growth, and resilience. Those are the four things that I can always return back to. And those are things that I prioritize in my life. So faith in the unknown, faith in those moments where you can't see through the dimly lit night and you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Family, because my family are the reason why I do most of the things that I do, because they've supported me, given me the opportunities that I have. And growth is to do right by those sacrifices. It's to constantly try and be better, try and seek to extract every ounce of value from every opportunity. And then resilience, because I've had to be resilient. I've had to be able to fight through those difficult times and those hard times, because it's not always going to be smooth sailing. It's not always going to be a linear upward trajectory. So I wrote those down, I think in 2014 when I first got injured, and I have them as my screensaver on my phone: faith, family, growth, and resilience.
Yeah. And it's really important, as someone famously once said, to have strong opinions loosely held. But the thing that you shouldn't hold too loosely is your values and the principles by which you'll live your life, your moral integrity. That shouldn't be loose, because when it is, that's when we get unraveled. Thank you for that. I found that very, very powerful. Faith, family, growth, resilience. Purpose question, PQ after MQ. What gives your life meaning and purpose? Why do you do what you do? It's your dharma, your calling, your vocation, your ikigai, as the Japanese would say. What's your ikigai, Christian?
It's to explore the limits of my potential. I've been blessed with a journey of diverse experiences where I've been able to explore things that I never could have imagined in going to the NFL and playing professional sport and now turning to the bar. But beyond that, it's exploring the limits of my potential in every avenue and opportunity, whether that's speaking as a speaker in Speakers for Schools, or coaching or mentoring within academies, because I feel like my journey and the experiences that I've had in my journey need to be shared. And so in furthering and exploring my potential and the limits of my potential, if that leads me to bigger and better things that I can then forge a path that others may then be able to follow, if I can communicate that journey, then I feel like that's my life's purpose.
Well, it is so important to think about that sense of purpose and shaping it and reviewing your life and thinking, what is my purpose now? Because you've had 7 surgeries, a lot of situations where you've had to reflect and review, but you also have Margaret as a mentor. How did that come about? And tell people about Margaret, why she's a special mentor for you.
So I have a boardroom now, really, of mentors who I can turn to for different aspects of my career, my personal life, and what I'm trying to do. And I decided to move on from playing last summer. And I knew that in trying to navigate my transition to life at the bar and away from professional sport, the hardest thing is not knowing what you don't know. So as a player, you're always coached. You're always listening for little bits of information that may make the difference between success or coming short on the weekend. So I thought I wanted to take that same apprentice mentality and apply it to my next endeavor. And Margaret Casey-Hayford is one of the people who I would consider a founding board member effectively on my journey, where she's done some special things with her career and has insights that I could only hope to learn over the course of the next 20, 30 years. And so being able to lean on her for her sage advice and direction and leadership I've always turned to and gravitated towards strong women in my life. I have a strong mother, aunts as well. And she is someone who has had to face adversity in her own experience, being a Black woman operating in the field that she is. So someone who also understands what it's like to struggle, to defy the odds, and being able to lean on her is honestly, it's a blessing.
Yeah, no, you're very lucky, and I found her very inspiring, very straight talking, no mess. You know what you know what you're gonna deal with. Health quotient is the next one. Clearly very important as a athlete, twice over, really, a two-sport professional athlete. But now you're going to have to be a business athlete. And what's the two things from physical and brain health that you're going to focus on that you would advise others are really key to success in just keeping your health? Because we know if we look after our health, it affects our immune systems improved, and it also affects our brain health and our ability to live longer. So what's your two bits of advice?
I'll always try and draw on my career as an athlete, where it's a real privilege because essentially you are allowed to pay, you're paid to play a child's game, but in service and in performance of your contract, you're asked to be the best version of yourself physically and mentally, and to turn up to work every single day ready to perform at the highest level. And I don't think that's something habitually that needs to stop just because you're not playing anymore. So I take a lot of the same tools and habits and routines that I had in my playing career, which allowed me to keep going forward and moving forward through the ranks. And so the largest ones actually are hypnosis. I do hypnosis and a lot of meditation, trying to break that 10,000 hours of experience mold. When I went to America, where I knew I didn't have enough time to catch up in that manner, I sought out mental coaching and professional help, and was able to explore hypnosis and be able to train my mind in a state that didn't require physical expenditure. So effectively doubling my time of learning and performance and making me improve so much faster. So that's something that not only gives me space when I'm stressed and also allows me to prime myself for performance ahead of time, but also is just a routine that I combine with a yoga practice, with walking in nature, with I have a stationary exercise bike. I bought a watt bike for my flat now, where I'm no longer having to train for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours a day and physically demand as much from my body. But at the same time, one of my coaches always used to say, a body in motion stays in motion. And with the injuries that I have had, I know that for myself, it's about constantly moving, lubricating the joints, being able to stay flexible, mobile, and not succumb to the nature of those injuries and let them win. So now moving into law, why wouldn't I be practicing with hypnosis in terms of delivery, in terms of being able to perform better in court, understand assignments and what's required of me, and then beyond that, staying physically healthy so I can stand tall, so I can stand upright and project when I'm in court and having to give submissions.
Yeah. No, I think the whole area of previewing how you're going to perform, almost time and again, imagining you're playing that game or you're giving that presentation or you're standing at the bar and speaking, it definitely sets people up for success. So well done on that. And it's nice to, I don't think I would have imagined, 10 years ago, hearing a former NFL player talking about the kind of things you've just been talking about. Just as I, as a former army officer, people would have been laughing at me at the bar if I'd been telling them, not the bar with the beers in. If I was telling them that that's what I was going to be doing, and yoga retreats and mindfulness and meditation and doing ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru and things like this. Emotional and social quotient. How do you use your emotions intelligently? I mean, you strike me mature beyond your years, very able to build rapport within minutes of meeting me when we first chatted some weeks ago. What's your tip on how to do that? Because it's a key skill, and sometimes in the law, I found some people are very high IQ, but their EQ is appalling. Just as some doctors, as my brother's a doctor, have very high IQ, but their bedside manner is awful. So what's your tip building that?
Having felt unheard for large parts of my life and felt like I was looking on the outside in, I understand what that feeling is. And I think that's what allows me to try and relate more to people or understand a different point of view, as well as having lived in other cultures and had that cross-cultural exchange. But beyond that, it's fundamentally, is the person you're dealing with or speaking to, is their opinion being heard? Is their life's experience, even if you don't understand in its entirety, are you able to, in some area, relate to an aspect of it? And I think that having been able to be in those situations where I felt like the person I'm speaking to or who's coaching me doesn't understand me as a person, I place a huge value on trying to make people feel heard and understood.
That's a really important one. And it's great when you really are interested in someone's life story, as I am. I mean, it's part of our job here as a broadcaster myself, is to find your story and get you to tell your story. And when you've got an interview who's not really interested, he's just going through the motion and trying to get onto their particular agenda that they've got, their angle. And this one, my angle is I'm interested in what makes inspiring leaders like you, and how can you inspire leadership in others. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. So my next question, Christian, is a particular one dear to your heart: collaborative, cognitive, and cultural intelligence. How have you dealt with the ability to deal with people very different from you and to recognize diversity, equality, and inclusion?
That all is underpinned by my experience in team sport. I would actually lean on Coach Tomlin, the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I had a moment where I was able to speak to him. We were both on the elliptical machine next to each other for half an hour. And it was a moment of real humanity where a coach who's on such a pedestal in terms of society and expectation in that sport in America, where he's one of the few consistent, high achieving and performing Black head coaches in the National Football League, to be able to have a few moments to speak with Mike Tomlin, the person, rather than the coach, and to get his understanding of how he effectively is the general for a 200-person machine, which generates billions of dollars, and whose performance every week is assessed by whether you win or lose. How is he able to galvanize a group of 60-odd players and get them to put their bodies on the line and go above and beyond and give the extra effort that ultimately is the decision and the decisive factor between winning and losing championships? He said to me that he tries to run a football team like a basketball team. A basketball team has far fewer people. It has up to 12 players, whereas a football team sometimes has 90, as well as coaches, backroom staff, training staff, ticket sales, marketing. And he said, I try and get to know every single person as an individual first before I ask them to put their hand in the pile and make a contribution to the cause. And that really struck me. And that goes, I guess, back to the essence of feeling heard and seen and understood. Because, again, tying back to the visibility piece, I had someone who was such a high performer, high achiever, and leader on such a consistent basis, taking the time to speak with me, an English player who'd never played the game before, but he made me feel and he gave me a legitimate chance, not based on my background or where I came from, but by my performance and the effort that I put forward on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, fantastic. He's someone we ought to have on this podcast.
Yeah,
no, that's the person then. Mike Tomlin. That's your mission, all right? Get Mike on this podcast. Say he is your inspiration. A very inspiring guy. Resilience quotient, picking yourself up in times of adversity. I don't think you've had any adversity, have you?
Not much.
Have I missed that? No, just a small amount. Resilience, being comfortable, being uncomfortable with being comfortable, being uncomfortable. But what tip would you give people about resilience? People listening, they've all had bad moments too, but you've had your fair share, more than your fair share. What's a good tip that served you well in those days when you're in such pain and such agony, and out of business for 726 days? What's your advice?
sometimes you have to be okay with sitting in it and being patient and embracing it and feeling the pain ultimately, because when you emerge from that experience, you'll be hardened by it. You'll be better able to cope with situations that may be different, but ultimately might poke the same wound or be as triggering as that experience. And life will never stop throwing curveballs at you. And sometimes it takes longer to recover from situations than others. So after I came back from my back injury, I had a brachial plexus, which is a shoulder stinger where I couldn't lift my arm for 5 to 6 months because of nerve damage. And sometimes that doesn't come back, sometimes it does. In my case, it did come back. But because I'd had 2 years of an experience of excruciating pain and not being able to walk properly, it made me grateful for the fact that, well, I can walk, I just can't lift one arm. So there's other stuff I can do. And so when you have a mindset of gratitude, but also have taken the time to be patient and really work your way back to health, back to being the best version of yourself, that's ultimately what resilience is. It doesn't mean that bad things won't happen again.
Yeah, great examples there. Brand, reputation, image, and impact. Goodness, you've been in the business of brand all the way through. Now you're in your new brand. I mean, I think you've got a very powerful brand already that you built up by the age of 29. What about 360? Do you get any 360 feedback? And how do you learn from others how you're perceived?
That's in terms of 360, it's interesting because when you're playing, you have the internal feedback from your head coach, your offensive coordinator, your position coach, and then ultimately 80,000 fans in a stadium or whoever's online wanting to critique your game. And so I suppose it doesn't really get more 360 than that in terms of people who don't even know you are commenting on your performance. And one thing that as professionals you have to learn very early in your career, the correct voices to listen to, because not everyone understands your journey, not everyone understands or has sight of all of the work that you're putting in. And so you have to have key stakeholders or a boardroom, in my case, of people that I turn to and ask for direction, and also to help me understand either how I'm being perceived or is my interpretation of a situation an accurate interpretation. So one thing I had to learn early in my career was to actually silence voices who actually aren't qualified to comment on your trajectory or where you're going.
Yeah, that's very important, particularly when you've got so many trolls and people out to trash you. Legacy, LQ, final one of the 8. What would you like your legacy to be in your personal life and in your work?
So a caring family man who always kept his word and did what he said he was going to do. So I'm someone who, if I set a goal or if I say I'm going to be somewhere, you can rely on me to be there. And that's personal and professionally, where there are obviously time constraints on everything that you do. But in terms of being able to prioritize, and when you make a commitment and give someone your word that you'll do something, you execute and you deliver. And I think that dependability, whether it's professionally or personally, I don't have any children at the moment, but that's something that I was able to experience when I wouldn't see my dad, but whenever it mattered, he'd always be there and I wouldn't have to worry about whether he'd turn up or not.
Yeah, that's a lovely one. I always make sure I do that with my daughter. We had some dad and daughter time. I took them to Dubai as a special treat before they get married this year. And one of the lovely things that will always stay with me is they said, Dad, whatever we went through, when we needed you, you were always there. Even if we were grumpy, you were there for us. And that's something I'm very proud of, that I throughout my time as a father for their 28 and 29 years, I've always been there for them. Executive teams or teams. How do you take, you've been in many football, in rugby, football, and NFL teams. What have the people you've been with, the good leaders and the coaches, done when they've got a toxic team or a team that's gone bad? The culture's just not right. If there was one bit of advice that you'd pass on from sport that is useful in business too, what's the bit of advice?
I was able to see from Worcester Warriors, who have since gone into liquidation, and then contrast that experience directly with the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are one of the most successful franchises in NFL history, having won 6 Super Bowls. And I was also able to see how each environment dealt with adversity differently, dealt with losses, dealt with things not going their way, whether it's injuries and things like that. So I would say that the greatest lesson that I took from my time in Pittsburgh was that strength of leadership and understanding and conviction about a purpose and a destination ultimately reduces the chance of any toxicity within your team, because I was able to see a man in Mike Tomlin who, when we started, I think 1-4, which is 1 win and 4 losses, and the whole city was calling for his head for him to lose his job, decide to steer the ship and take complete responsibility. And the thing that he used to say in most meetings was, don't get into little groups and try and solve the world's problems on your own, because more often than not, when a team isn't winning, everyone has their own idea about why it's not winning. And that's where leadership comes to the fore, because he made it his responsibility to direct the team towards success. And it wasn't for us as players to go into little groups and try and moan and say everything that's wrong with the system or why we're losing. And it's for him to provide direction. And that's the thing that I learned the most was, don't get into small groups and try and solve problems by moaning and being negative. And that's ultimately born by strength of leadership.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. I haven't heard that one before, and I would agree with it. And I've seen that happen where people splinter off into small groups and they all start having water cooler conversations about what's wrong. Just as if you run a poor meeting, people will have a meeting before the meeting and a meeting after the meeting, because the meeting itself was badly run and didn't make a decision. And then they'll think, well, look, we can just get at the boss and get him to change his opinion after the meeting, though he's made his mind up. And some get that. Last 2 questions. The first one, Christian, is a favorite book on leadership, on health, well-being, or perhaps sport leadership that you'd recommend people have a read, and why you choose that one.
Bill Walsh, The Score Takes Care of Itself. That was a book, one of the early books that I read when I was recovering from my back injury. And that's what gave me the faith to not rely on results and instead focus on the fact that preparation and consistency ultimately leads to the score taking care of itself, where it becomes almost inevitable, where if you have proper planning, preparation, and review, that will lead to good performance. And it's not actually the singular effort, it's actually the sum of consistency. So that was a great book in terms of Bill Walsh obviously was a pioneer in American football in terms of creating a new style of offense, and that bred to success. And I feel like being able to lean on American football and the lessons it teaches you, because ultimately it's extremely competitive. It's a violent sport. It's a sport of numbers in terms of the practitioners and the players involved, where there are 40 people on each team playing in any game, plus coaching staff. And there's a lot of lessons in leadership that can be taken from the great NFL coaches.
Very true. Very true. Interesting. And perspectives I've not had before. Thank you. So, Christian, would you finally introduce yourself again? Tell us what you do and give us your 2-minute top leadership tip.
I'm Christian Scotland-Williamson, former 2-sport professional athlete, broadcaster, speaker, and future barrister. My top tip is, the standard is the standard. How you do anything is how you do everything.
Wow, that's a lovely one. Christian, it's been an absolute honor having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm certain you'll go from strength to strength. Please keep in contact, and I will watch your career and help you in any way I can. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.